Recorded on the cloud. Okay, so it should be recording. Hi, everybody. A lot of you will probably be joining us after this chats at the Vacc, and that's absolutely okay. We're going to make sure to make this recording available to you all. We're planning on creating a YouTube channel for the Vacc and upload the videos there. I know that with everybody's schedule being so different, it was difficult to kind of find the time that worked for everybody. So recording it is. And so we'll go with it. Today we have Dr. Angemil Perez-Peña, which I'm really excited about because Dr. Perez-Peña and I go way back. She used to be my mentor when I was in the master's program. So I feel like I hold very dear memories with you, and I'm really, really excited for you to share one of the many passions that you hold. Before we jump in, I have a couple of announcements, and I'm going to share my screen really quick. And these are just a couple of reminders for everybody at the Vacc or in the CED program in general. Let's see, where's my screen? So we have a list of people that will be joining us in the next couple of weeks. Saron and Jasmine will be joining us in 2 weeks from now to talk about school counseling, the things that they didn't learn, they felt like they didn't get a chance to learn at school, but definitely learned on the job. Then Emilia Gross will be joining us talking about school counseling. We did have to reschedule Alex Smith, who will also be talking about school counseling in rural communities, but we'll get back to you with some dates. Then we're going to have on March 29th, Dr. Tasha Beckton, and she's going to be doing like an Ask Me Anything type of talk. She does so many different things. We'll send out the flyer. Then on April the 5th, we're going to have Dr. Camila Purgar talking about suicide prevention. And on the 15th, on April the 15th, we'll have Carolina Guizar, a dietitian, to talk about nutrition and mental health. We're hoping to have someone talk about motivational interviewing, but we'll keep you posted on that. Just a couple of other reminders. So, okay, today we're going to be doing talking to Dr. Perez-Peña about culturally informed couples counseling. And so just to show you the quick flyer for the 1 and 2 weeks, again, we're going to have Saron, this is misspelled, Saron and Jasmine. So, all right, so let me stop sharing my screen. Oh, another quick reminder was, let me see if I can find that flyer. Oh, I'll share it at the end. All righty. So let me go ahead and pass it on to you. Could you tell us a little bit about who you are and what do you do and what are you here to talk about?
Well, thank you, Melissa. I'm so excited to be here. Like you mentioned, like it's full circle. We have that connection and we both have the passion of couples work. I know that we both are products of UNCG and we did the master's in couples and family focus. So today, just a little bit about myself. I guess I'll share that. I did my master's in couples and family and I did my doctorate in UNCG of counselor education. One of the things though, when I went into the couples and family, the reason I picked that as my concentration specialization was actually because I wanted to work with adolescents. Not so much because I only wanted to work with couples, but my belief coming from a Latino culture, from a collectivistic culture, is that you cannot work with an individual without at least understanding the system they belong, at least having a grasp of like, you might be working with an adolescent and they may be your client, but the reality is that the client is everyone that's not in the room, right? The family, maybe the different dynamics that are going on. So that was my interest that introduced me to couples work. In fact, I kind of took a step away from couples work until a few years later because I wanted to come into couples work when I felt I was in a place where I can really sit with couples without having my own transference, without having things that were coming up for me that were hard. One of the questions we'll get to that were introduced was like, how do you deal with not having feelings about wanting to kind of jump in there and be like, no, you're right, you're wrong, or whatever feelings are coming up. And I think part of that was early on identifying that there is a power of recognizing when you can hold space for a certain population, for a certain presentation, for a certain specialization such as couples work. There's a time to recognize when it's not your time to be there. And for me, that was also part of my journey, noticing where I needed to heal in my attachment kind of journey, and making sure to come into the space now where I feel very integrated, where I feel very whole, where I have a really good framework of me as an individual, and therefore I can enter into couples work and really focus on the couple. So that's something that I would say about me. Other than that, I would say I have, to your point, many passions, many interests, but one that's really important for me is culturally informed counseling. In today's conversation, we're going to be talking about couples counseling, but what I'm going to provide and the conversation you and I are going to kind of facilitate together, because I'm asking you to join and make this more of a discussion, is really understanding that culturally informed is not a prescriptive way of doing counseling. It's more of a lens that we're always actively considering what else is in the room, what is not maybe visible to me, but is still necessary to understand to be able to work with the client. So we'll focus on couples counseling, but I hope that you can kind of transfer this to school counseling. You can transfer this if you're working with adolescents. You can transfer this if you're working with any other population. And I think that's what's really neat about what we'll be talking about today.
I really love there are several things that you named that I really, really like. And one of them is always having that awareness of how our own stuff shows up in the room. So I'm really excited about like hearing a little bit more about that, about the counter transference, but also like it's okay for us to show up fully and not feel like we have to just like push everything to the side in order to do the work that we're so passionate about. And then the other part that I really appreciate is that like the ongoing work and how it can look, because I think that depending on where counselors may be developmentally speaking and their learning experience, what I do find is that a lot of the students are coming with, well, like, but how do I do it? Give me a to-do kind of like checklist, or give me concretes. So I really appreciate that too.
I will say that that is very normal and that's good to have. And we will continue to give you some concretes in this conversation. I know that if you're in the couples track, you also have like emotion focused therapy, and there are a lot of things you'll receive that are concrete family systems. And today we're going to hold a conversation for those things that are a little bit more about the person, more of you as a counselor, more of you as a person that has so many influences to how you organize the world. And if that's true of you, it's extending that application of like, that's true of your clients, that's true of the couples that you're working with. So how do you start to unpack and see those, again, those parts of the story or the narrative or the individual that maybe otherwise would be overlooked and is having an impact on the presenting concern or the presenting kind of conversation that the couple is having in this case. So I think with that, I would like to actually, I'll share sometimes a screen, Melissa, but then I'll also take it off so that you and I can be kind of seeing each other. But with that, I wanted to see if I could share my screen. I don't know if you have to give me.
I think, let me know if it doesn't give you, I should be able to.
Let me see, it says host disabled participant screen sharing. So maybe if you make me co-host, it will allow me to do it.
That then.
And while you pull that up, the first kind of part of this conversation, and I wonder if you could share, is, you know, I want to welcome everyone to this interest of this conversation. I want to share my screen because I like pretty things, so I'm going to share it real quick. But really, it's just a place starting with the conversation of what was the first idea, Melissa, that you had, and I can share mine, and I'm asking you, if you're viewing this, to think about this. What was your first idea of love?
My first idea of love? Oh, that's a big question.
Right?
My first idea of love, I think that my brain immediately went to, as a kid, like seeing things on TV, and what was being modeled on TV in terms of what love was. So immediately my brain went to romantic love.
Okay.
And the ways in which it was like talked about, like the word love, that is, right? And so my brain immediately went to the idea of romantic love and the ways in which it was modeled on TV. And then I'm noticing my brain going towards like, okay, and as the years passed along, having an understanding of what does love look like within my own family system, and then kind of picking up from there, like with greater awareness was also like expanded my understanding
Idea of love.
Mm-hmm.
do you feel like for like something, as you said, that made me think of, like, in Spanish, we have te amo y te quiero, right?
Yes.
So te amo is I love you. Te quiero is like, it's a weird translation because technically is I like you, but typically te quiero is reserved for like friendships or less like intimate relationships. And some people will feel often like if you tell them te amo, they're like, whoa, that's not what this is about. So I wonder if even in thinking about it, like when you were saying that, I was like, that makes sense to me that the first thing that came up was romantic love, because it's similar to me. Like the first thing when I think of love, it's romantic love. And then it kind of goes into like the other kinds of love. And to your point, as we've grown up, or as I've grown up and developed, that's expanded to include so many more things of like what I love, what is love, what does that constitute? But that question starts to unpack this really important concept of love is many things, and language and our ideas of love matter. And that is true of our couples that are working with us. So when we think of couples, we think of many different types of couples. If we think of language, we think of how language has evolved, right? So for instance, not too long ago, if you were in the family and the couples and family track, it would have been the marriage and family track. So doing so and changing language, we've expanded to say the only committed relationship is not marriage. Marriage in many ways was restrictive, can still be restrictive for some people, and it does not necessarily embody all kinds of commitment. So in thinking of love, it is important for us to understand that we have ideas of love, our couples have ideas of love, and very possible they have different ideas. So even if you're working with a couple that identifies in any kind of different partnership, they may have a different understanding of what that means based on what the first concept they incurred of like love. Maybe they had different generations, maybe they had different sections of culture, maybe even within the same culture, they may have grown up in slightly different homes that were influenced with other variables such as religion or such as being a child of an immigrant. So a lot of things that we want to be unpacking. And I think these images kind of just to start to talk about the conversation of love is so different for a lot of people, even though we kind of have this understanding that it's this universal thing that we all can relate to in some level. But the understanding is what is love, and starting to unpack that with our couples is part of the being culturally informed. So I'm really going to rock your boat by not rocking it at all, in the sense that that is a very basic thing to say, what is love? And seeing and hearing what our couples say can be very information filled. It could be very telling, and it can really lead to some rich discussions that maybe they themselves have not had. So again, as we move forward in this conversation, I want you to think about what are all the things that we ask or don't ask to a couple that can be important to consider. And that's what we're really challenging today, is how are we making those decisions? And I want to suggest that oftentimes we're making those decisions mostly based on our own worldviews, mostly based on what we've expanded our idea of love. And it can have blind spots, and it doesn't mean that you're going to have the perfect intake or going to have the most inclusive language. And I would even kind of, because of this context, I would even caution us to be overly academic. There are a lot of languages that we're using in academic literature that is not reflective necessarily of how people talk. So for instance, a common term that we now are comfortable with is Latinx population. I was having a conversation recently, literally 2 weeks ago, and I was like, oh, I work with Latinx population. And someone was like, Latinx, what is that? And I explained what it was and how the intention, what was the intention behind Latinx, and how in Spanish you have feminine and masculine pronouns, and that's really exclusive in some ways. And the person was just kind of, it went over their head. They're like, they didn't understand it. So what I want to offer too is we want to be informed by the evidence, but we also want to be informed by the culture of the individual, that we're not so far ahead in our research and our understanding of evidence-based practices that we're too ahead. we're too far and we're not coming together with the client, with the couple. So that's just a suggestion that I'm going to offer the group as we continue is language matters. And even if you think you have the most reflective language, the most updated language, just listening to what the couple is utilizing in their conversation, and then utilizing that language as well as reflecting and offering some new language. Because again, as we get into this, let's go into what relational cultural theory offers you as a framework, as kind of maybe some guidance. And we'll come back to some of these ideas of like, what is a couple? What is a committed relationship? Marriage historically, what did that serve in our society? Has there been some disproportion? I would say in different populations, marriage wasn't always accessible, economically accessible. It wasn't always possible because of legality of things. So let's continue this conversation and we'll come back a little bit more to this in just a moment.
And let me kind of point out that I think it's such a great, what you just asked me is it's a big deal in the sense of how we make assumptions of what is our client's definition of love. Like we come in as therapists, as counselors, making our own assumptions as to like, what is it that our clients are looking for and what is it that our needs are, whether we're aware of it or not, by the way. I think that's an important point to make, that we do bring in our own biases and assumptions in terms of, well, what does helping this couple or this partnership or this family look like? And so I really want to invite people to think about that as well. Like, what is your own definition of love? What was the first thing that came to mind? Yeah, so thank you.
It's so important because, and then thinking about what you're saying is like thinking about how they intersect. So the first idea of love, even though I had a lot of like embodied experiences of love, the love that I remember, believe it or not, are the telenovelas I watched in secrecy that my parents didn't know I was watching. And I was like, that is love, you know, that I have a few that pop into my head that I was so enamored by the idea of it, that it was very dramatic. It was very, honestly, if you look at, I don't know if English soap operas reflect the same, but I could probably make some guesses that they don't necessarily exhibit the healthiest relationships or love relationships. But they, like, I think of like this really big novela, Usurpadora. I don't know if you ever heard of it. It was like a twin sister.
My mom.
It was a complete like distortion of reality of like, and then again, we think of those things and I was like, oh, I just watched that. That didn't have an impact of my idea of love. But didn't it have an impact? Did it not have an idea of what demonstrations of love or what behaviors we thought were acceptable, that now we look at it as adults and say, maybe that's, you know, like something within generation that we can relate to, like Twilight. They were very much observed for being very toxic in the language and the conversation of like basically stalking the love interest. And that was something that was depicted as extreme romance, extreme, the epitome of like love for not even that long ago. That was what, like 10, 15 years ago when those stories came out. So again, to your point, we may think that those things will impact us, right? But they do. They have an impact of like, what were these ideas and how do they impact us? And welcome to our participant that's here. So hopefully you're joining the conversation. We're really making this more of a conversation. And if you wanted to, you can introduce yourself, but I'm not also putting you on the spot, although I feel like I just did.
Yeah, no worries. I'm Khalees. I use she, they pronouns. And I work with Melissa. I am the other GA at the Vacc.
Nice to meet you, Khalees. It's so nice to have you here. So we're kind of dropping in just a conversation of love. And what does that mean? The question we've been kind of considering is, what ideas come to us when we think of love, and what are these concepts, what they were influenced. So I'm gonna push us to relational cultural theory here, move us along, and then we're gonna have a discussion of how can this help us start to really consider culturally informed care not being this abstract or this far-reaching experience, but really it's about recognizing that outside of race and ethnicity, we also have culture. And culture, everyone walks in with a certain level of culture that is influenced by what income they grew up in. You know, did they live in poverty? Did they live, has that changed in their lifetime? What were some of the main influences? So relational cultural theory purpose and kind of proposes, and this is something that we have the neuroscience to back up, is that ultimately humans are hardwired for connection. And the reason this matters is because when a couple comes into our room, we understand that they desire to connect. No matter if you see a couple, which I don't have the source for this, but the statistic is something like couples come into the room 7 years after the presenting problem has been present. That's a really big kind of red flag to know as a couples counselor, is that most people you see, you may not come in to see in your space, are going to be the lovey-dovey couples that are working at something preemptively, or that are coming into you to be like, hey, we just want to work this out before it becomes an issue. Most people come in and they are hurting. They've been hurting for a long time, and they feel absolutely disconnected with themselves, with each other, and maybe with the world. And relational cultural theory is a theory that really starts to help us organize what are all the influences on an individual. And you can use different interventions from different theoretical models and also orientations. But RCT really starts to tell us, listen, when we take everything away, we know that people want to be connected. So how do we start to organize the space that we're working with clients to really solicit an understanding of what is causing the disconnection? What is causing disconnection maybe with their bodies? What is causing the disconnection with their partnership? What is creating this disconnection because they are in pain? Fun fact, emotional pain registers in our brain the same as our physical pain. So when we experience chronic disconnection, I get goosebumps thinking about that. Like, it is a physical pain that someone's experienced. And often as counselors, we just may get stuck on the complexity of couples, but if we strip everything out, we can just say, wow, this person is hurting, and they're hurting with someone that they thought that should love them. And it's a really hard place to be, because this is the maybe last resort, because couples often find that if I can't be safe here, where am I safe? Where am I connected? If my couple or my partner, if the person is committed to me in one way or another, doesn't get it, who will get it? And that can be very disheartening. That can be very experienced very largely, even if the presenting concern doesn't seem that big. So RCT starts to give us some really good indications of what to consider. And I'll give you a few bullet points. But one of the main principles in that we're hardwired for connection is that we have this thing that is called the 5 good things, that when we're in healthy relationships, we have a few indicators that give us a good kind of thumbs up of like, hey, this is a good relationship. Not so much focus on behavior, but that there are certain experiences that we're looking for in relationships. One being that we feel really clear about ourselves. We feel good about ourselves. We have an understanding of ourselves. That when we're talking to this person, we don't walk out kind of leaving like this feeling of like, I feel less like me, that we're feeling more like me. The other indicator is that we're getting more energy, what they call zest, a zest for life. You just have that invigorating feeling, that you feel more creativity, that you feel a sense of empowerment of like, no, my experiences matter, or what I want to do in this world matters, and that we have the sense of connection. However, humans experience something from RCT, we call it the central relational paradox, that even though we want connection, we have so many strategies of disconnection. We have so many things that we do that kind of stop the connection. So let me stop here and think about this and check in with, Melissa and Khalees, like, how does that resonate for you, especially when we think about couples, but just even thinking about yourself, especially that last piece of like, oftentimes when we want connection the most is when we disconnect the most, because that's when we have something to lose. That's when we're maybe hurting already, or that's when we're like, I'd rather not care because, I'm not going to be the one that's going to be seen a fool. And that's, we can get into that in attachment kind of language. It's very based on our attachment style of, do we have secure attachments, or are we anxiously attached, or do we have the withholding attachment or the pursuing attachment? So there's certainly some space to go deeper on this, but just from like that kind of bird's view, what connects with you from understanding that ultimately we're all hardwired for connection, and that oftentimes when we're feeling disconnected, that can be something that drives us towards disconnection, ironically.
For me, the first thing that came up was fear. Just like that fear of hurt and safety. Fear and safety, right? And even as I say that out loud, like even thinking about the thing, how being vulnerable has been modeled for us, depending on where we are or what kind of generational trauma our family may carry. Yeah, those were some of the things that came up, because I could just go on a whole tangent.
But I love what you said, and I want to earmark this, and we're going to come back to this. How vulnerability and love has been modeled for us. What has shaped those images? And I'm going to give you a term as relational images. How has those been formed by society, by family culture, by individual experiences? And we'll come back to that. Thank you for sharing.
Yeah, for me, you know, just transparently, for the large majority of my life, I've had an anxious avoidant attachment style. And so I really resonate with okay, I want connection, but when I am faced with a connection that my body and mind knows can be so wonderful, the other part of me is like, nope. So if it's this good, then my like avoidance or self-sabotage or thinking, finding all the ways that this isn't good for me to protect myself goes up to where I noticed where with people where, again, my mind and body can tell like, okay, we probably aren't going to get as connected. Those avoidance techniques went decreased because I was like, okay, this feels safer to me than something up here that feels so connected, because of that vulnerability piece that Melissa said. Because when you're connected, it's kind of, you can't really hide. When you're truly connected, they see you, you see them. And that comes with a lot of fear too.
They see you, and you see them. And this is such a great segue. Thank you, Khalees, for sharing that. It's like, there's so much about our own attachment that goes into a relationship. And I would even make a kind of parallel process as a counselor. Your own attachment is in the room. So to your point, Khalees, like if you have a couple that makes you feel very uncomfortable because of what they're going through, that's going to bring up some of your attachment stuff. And I've recognized that in my work with couples. There are some couples that make me so anxious that I'm like, oof, I need to do some deep breathing here, because it's activating my own experiences, or it's activating my own trauma or my own attachment. And that's important to also recognize. Where are you? What has been your experience? What, again, going back, what are your kind of worldviews, but also what are your internal experiences with relationships? And again, I do believe this, and this is why I don't go into like the prescriptive of like how to work with couples. I think the way you work with couples is you attach yourself. You have to work on yourself and grow in this connection, because you can't lead people into a connection that you do not know. And I would say couples connection is the hardest thing to facilitate, in my opinion. It is extremely difficult because you're working with so many people in the room that are not even in the room. You're working with so many events that are in the room, even though they're not in the room. You're working with so many things that are really difficult. And the only way to me to cut through it is through connection. And knowing that our tendency is to avoid it, not only for avoiding attachment, but I think that's just our tendency. That's the central paradox of like, we don't want to fail at connecting. It's hard to fail at it. It's hurt to fail at it. And no different than, I wouldn't go jump off a 2-floor building because I know I'm probably going to land bad on my knees and it's not going to be great. Why would we do that emotionally? So it's natural for us to avoid it and to kind of be like, let's take a step back. That's going to lead us to that emotional pain that is registered in our brain the same as physical pain. So thank you both for sharing. The last thing you said, I think, is a great segue to now understanding how do we start to introduce, specifically working with BIPOC couples, with working with LGBTQ plus couples, with working with marginalized identities within the couple relationship. You said something that I think resonates of like, when people are connected, they're seen and they see. So let's bring in this lens of the historical and the social disconnection that many individuals have experienced. Not only are they maybe experiencing disconnection within their coupleship, they may also be experiencing disconnection in their experience in this life, how they have been in this world, how have they been experienced in this world, what are some of the messages that they've received. Relational images refers to just all the different ideas they have about certain identities. That may be of their own, that may be of you as a counselor, but there's so many of these kind of like concepts that we have stored in our mind consciously and not, and unconsciously, that we have in the back of our brain, just kind of all these ideas of like, what does a healthy relationship look like? What does a loving relationship look like? And a lot of those things may not look like what you are. And that can start to create this connection between your identities and the identities you see. Specifically with BIPOC couples and with LGBTQ plus couples, we're starting to then enter into this whole realm of what are some of the messages they've received about being a same-sex couple? What are some of the messages that they've received of being a vulnerable man in a Latino couple that is heterosexual maybe, but then is breaking a lot of norms by being maybe very emotionally available or by believing that they are equal roles? What are the ideas that maybe a different generation has, be it that it's an older generation, that they grew up with some ideas that really didn't resonate with them, that are suppressing and oppressing to them, or even newer generations that maybe have some different identities from what they grew up with, or from the identities or relational images they have of what a couple should look like. So I read this article recently, which I love because I kind of self-identify a bit with this, of people really starting to recognize that partnership goes beyond romantic. And it was, I think in the New York Times, this idea of platonic partnerships, which I had never seen so organized. And it was something that I was like, thank you. Someone's talking about this idea that because of where we are in society and history, there may be some other privileges or some other opportunities of partnership that don't look exactly like maybe back 50 years ago, 100 years ago. If we think of women and what historically marriage meant for women, oftentimes it was a sort of transactional or something that was necessitated because of the economics of marriage, and that they could not own things and they could not have their own independence. And with that having changed for a lot of places, a lot of spaces in this world, it starts to create this idea of what else is possible. And I think with that, it's exciting, but it's also important for us as counselors to not discount what people are experiencing as partnership, what individuals are coming into you, you're not trying to fit it into a box. Because that's something that we can inadvertently do very easily by saying, oh, so is that, or do you mean, or does that mean, like you disclose something as a client and you're trying to fill in the gap with what your understanding is of what a couple is. So let me share a couple of guiding posts that RCT offers us, and then we'll kind of zero in the rest of the time talking about the questions that were submitted for the group to talk about. So RCT shares a few more guiding posts. This is very bird's view, so I think relational culture theory is a great theory to get into. When I found it, I just felt like it mixed a lot of my worldviews and the ways I understood. It captures cultural messages. It understands that you do not operate in isolation, that an individual is influenced by their time, by the history, by the identities they hold, by so many things. It also considers attachment, and it also considers how the underlying belief is everyone's wired for connection and that we grow through connection. So it approaches human growth from an underlying assumption that humans grow and develop through deep connection and mutuality and growth fostering relationships. The power of that is that people in healthy relationships and growth fostering relationships, in what I would believe a therapeutic relationship would be, or you aim to have, are going to naturally grow. You don't have to tell someone that they have to develop healthier habits. You don't have to tell someone that maybe, binge drinking isn't healthy for their body, because that comes into the space of, it starts to address the disconnection that may be leading to the symptoms that we're addressing from this kind of, even though we try not to, I think it's still some pathology, even as a counselors, we kind of deal with some presenting problems as a bit of a pathology model. So RCT tells us that. It tells us also skills. You need to understand skills for connection and mutuality. Melissa said this. What have we been modeled for connection, for vulnerability? It may be that a couple dearly wants to connect, but do they have the skills? What were the models of their families of origin? What were the models of the society, of the history, of where they were in time? And that's important for us to discover, uncover, and to facilitate. It is not necessarily a one fit kind of way of connection and mutuality, but we can start to understand from their worldview, what can we tap in their strength and resilience to help them kind of identify how to create greater connection within their relationships and mutuality. Mutuality referring to a two-way street in a relationship, something that is mutually empathetic and that has mutual empowerment in the relationship. And that's important for us to identify within the coupleship. How can we foster that? What are the skills they have and what are the skills they don't have? Redefining growth, it really comes from a place of like, we're not superimposing this idea of what healthy relationships are, while we do have markers, right? Like for instance, couples therapists are highly encouraged to understand if there's violence, if there's physical violence, emotional violence, but even in that, not assuming we understand what violence is always. And what I mean by that, and I carefully tread this line, is that sometimes when you work with BIPOC, specifically BIPOC clients, they may have some experiences that if you applied from a white-centered, Eurocentric lens, you'd be like, that is absolutely that's unhealthy, or that's absolutely not good. And we need to take a step back and say, okay, what is good in their relationship? Is it still fostering their growth? Is it something that they identify as giving them energy? If it is, and it's not one of those areas that we know are clearly marked kind of like an area that we need to grow and kind of help them and be safe, then we want to kind of teeter the discomfort of not being the experts in the room and letting them be the experts in the room of their life. So I think that's really important too, especially working with BIPOC clients. I find that my biggest frustration in applying emotion-focused therapy was how it was not normed in non-white middle SCS clients and couples. And I found myself with couples being like, yeah, sure. Let's whatever you're talking about, the dance or whatever you want to talk about that, I need you to tell me how to fix this. I need you to tell me what is good, what is bad. And I was flustered. I was like, what? I don't know what you want. I'm not supposed to be this directive. So again, RCT says it's okay. We can kind of play around with just understanding some of these key tenets and these key areas. And there are more, but we're going to keep them to these three main areas that I want you to consider when you're approaching working with a couple. So let's go into this conversation a little bit more specifically, and then we'll open it up to the questions that were submitted to Melissa for this conversation, and we can kind of spend the time there. So I'll just ask, and I'll stop sharing the screen, what are some considerations when working with BIPOC couples and LGBTQ+ couples? And I've started the conversation, but Melissa and Khalees, like, any thoughts on what are some of the considerations, especially as we start to think of RCT and what it's suggesting that we at least uncover and discover and open the space, because it's always an invitation. It's not an assumption, and it's not something that we have to source as a counselor.
I think for me, coming from a queer white lens, if I was working with BIPOC couples, I think it is so crucial, like with any work, but to broach those identities and really spend a lot of time recognizing that what I might view as healthy or positive may be different, and really intentionally diving into, okay, what does your culture look like for you individually and as a couple? And how does that come together? Because even within the couple, I imagine, even if they do, have same identities, same cultures, it still could look different for both of them. And so trying to really understand what's showing up for them and then in the space with us.
That's so important to like the broaching, right? So broaching referring to entering into a conversation about the differences and similarities of our identity as a counselor and our clients and our couple. And even to your point, Khalees, what are the differences between them, right? So Divines and Colleagues gives us a multi-dimensional model that talks about what are the differences and similarities between the couple, the counseling relationship. What are the differences and similarities between their interact, which is race, ethnicity, and culture? So how are they maybe different from other people, or their identities, how they're different? And then interact, referring to what is maybe between different groups. So what are the differences that maybe one Latino couple may experience, but then a Latino from the Caribbean may have a completely different experience, or a Black couple or any other couple. So thinking about that, Khalees, that's really important. And I think something you said, and I wonder if anyone else considers this, is like also understanding. I've sometimes heard this from, I think honestly, academics, of like, well, I don't want to make a couple uncomfortable, and I don't want to broach something that's not a thing for them. And it's like, we're not talking about a thing. We're not making it a thing. We're not pathologizing it. We're not saying it's a thing, but it is part of their identity, right? How they experience the world and how they experience. So we're not coming from a deficit. We're just saying, what are your lived experiences? And I think that's important to distinguish, that we're not making it of, what are some special concerns you've had? We're saying, hey, you're different in this way, or I have the similarity and these are my experiences. I wonder what your experiences have been. And making it more of that relational, I think normalizing that we want to just invite the entire person into the conversation.
And how I personally like to introduce it is like, what are we bringing in the room with us? As we're like in this time together, what's showing up? And that is our lived experiences, our identities, our culture, like all of it. And so again, not that like deficit mindset of just, this is what it is. It shows up with us in every space. Let's talk about it.
Yeah, let's talk about it. Let's bring it into the room. Things that even maybe they didn't even know about it. And I think there's a compassion to that too, because I would say a lot of BIPOC individuals may not know something. Like I'm thinking not of a couple, but I'm thinking of a client. And it's like sometimes with understanding that when you're making an introduction, it's an invitation. And they may take them a couple sessions to then come back and say like, hi, Auntie, like what you said that time, I've never heard of that concept. But now that I'm thinking about it, I also identify, or I also have this experience. So it's really making those offerings to our clients from a culturally humble place of like, I wonder if this is part of your experience. I don't want to assume, correct me if I'm wrong. I'm wondering if there's something here, right? And sometimes they may say no, but I think it's also extending that invitation multiple times and knowing that it may take someone multiple times to kind of make that connection of like, I've never thought about it, but it does interact with my presenting concern as a couple. So I am mindful of time. Melissa, do you have something to kind of share in that area for us?
Like even as you two were talking about broaching, like it makes, and it being an invitation, it also made me think about the ways in which we're modeling for relationships to like also do that with one another. Because I think that unfortunately, when we have couples that are coming in and maybe they're biracial, bicultural, like there's differences in their identities in some shape or form. And we find that they're not talking about it. And maybe one or the other person, or maybe both, like continue to like build that inwards. Sometimes not aware that it's important to them to talk about it. Sometimes they are aware and they feel like it's going to bring up some other type of problems. So it made me think about that. And cultural values, it's so incredibly important for me to kind of sit with that and thinking about like when we think about values as a whole, what is important for each individual and how does it show up within the relationship or not? And is that having an impact for them?
Yes, and knowing that you also have to approach those developmentally, right?
Yes.
Because imagine the couple is coming, like if we think of it from an emotion focused therapy kind of like model, like you don't want a couple that's escalated to then be talking about like, well, what is your cultural value? but it's important to get there. We need to get to the place of like a lot of the disconnection is mostly coming, I would say, from misunderstanding and from not seeing each other. I love, again, like how Khalees said it, of like seeing and being seen is part of the love experience, whether it's romantic love or platonic love or just love in general. I know we use the word unconditional regard, but that's just a professional term for love, right? We care and love deeply for our clients. And I think that's something that's important for us to just kind of equate. I want to think of the questions that were posed. There's some I want us to spend a little bit more time, but again, I am mindful of the time. So there was one question that I just wanted to kind of briefly address. One of the questions that was submitted was, what advice would you give school counselors working with adolescent couples and or caregivers in a school setting? And the biggest advice I would give you is that even though the most likely the couples that you see or the kids, adolescents that you're working with are not going to be in the same relationship as an adult, right? So we have the tendency to think, well, then it's not valuable to talk about relationships. It's not valuable to do couples work. The reality is they're learning those first relational messages, the first relational images, the first ways to have a relationship at that age. And honestly, it could be so impactful to have a healthy model that they can start to identify what is it that you want, what is it that you're looking for in a partner, why do you like this person, what the feelings. If we come from relational cultural theory, I would be asking them what makes them feel good. If they're not describing that they have energy, if they're feeling like they have to change themselves, if they're feeling, I'm going to start broaching that and working with my clients, adolescent clients, to help them see, like, well, how do you feel in our relationship? Oh, I feel really excited to see you. I feel like, and that's when we start to make those parallels and say, well, I wonder what's different about that relationship, and starting to help them identify what is serving them and what is not serving them. So what I would say is take it as seriously as you would take it if a couple came to you, a married couple or a committed couple came to you working on their relationship. Adolescent work is just as important. Was there something, Melissa? I saw you unmuted. Is there something to add to there?
No, just not. I feel like a bobblehead right now because I'm like, yes to all the things.
It's really powerful. And it's also, it's fun. It's honestly fun. It's really fun to work. And let's not forget that a lot of adolescents, especially when we think of marginalized identities, they may experience violence and shame and a lot of exploitation that, if it's not addressed and if it's not talked about and if it's not taken seriously, can lead to a lifetime that could be cycles of abuse. So we want to break that cycle before it even starts. Another question that we got was, what does couples counseling look like for couples who have different rates of acculturation? I think in a very short answer is the broaching. It's important to bring that into the room and say, when you're understanding a person's couple, there may be two people that are coming from Mexican culture, but one is raised in the United States and one is actually born and raised in Mexico, and they later came to the United States. That's going to be a very different Mexican culture, right? Even though they may have some umbrella terms, they may have some models that are similar, they're going to be different. So to your point, you just address it and you normalize it and you provide some psychoeducation, and you may have to really bring that into the room and say, I'm translating this, what I'm hearing you say, person that's less acculturated, that's really hard for you. Person that is more acculturated, there is some value differences. And you're also normalizing what that acculturation means. What is the loss? What is maybe the grief that maybe someone's holding on to their culture and feels that their partner has kind of abandoned that culture, or has felt like they have gone into the dominant culture and kind of normalized some things that they would not want to because they value their culture. And that may be something that you have to address as never going to change, because if that person doesn't want to let go of their culture, they have the right to not let go of their culture, and especially if it comes from a place of strength and if it's something they identify where the goal is not acculturation. And that's where RCT would say we would redefine what growth is. For that couple, it may be understanding, it may be acceptance, it may be coming from a place when they get into these cycles of conflict, understanding, okay, this is showing up because for me, this is my model. For you, it's that model. So then we can kind of de-escalate the situation to actually understand. Because again, when we use the simple kind of summarization of RCT that Khalees gave us, was the point is for them to see each other. It's not to necessarily change or to have, but the transformation happens when people can not let their stuff get in the way of seeing the person they love. And that's really powerful work. So much. So another question we had is, could you talk about how to address religious differences in couples? I would add the same conversation we just had. It's about broaching. It's about bringing it into the room and redefining what growth is. If one couple expects that the other part of the couple is going to change, that they're going to change their religious identity, something I like to say often is like, and this is just I don't know if it's a bias or an opinion, but I tend to be more, well, you married someone that had a different religious belief. You can't just expect that that person's going to change, right? So I will definitely hold more accountable the person that accepted someone and then is changing the terms, right? So that to me is very important, where it's like just being a little bit more direct and saying like, okay, well, what did you think was going to happen 10 years ago? You know, that's something that you have to be more compassionate, and bringing them a little bit more accountable of how can you be compassionate, even if your hope is still for some change or some differences. Well, how can we have compassion because that person married someone that thought they accepted their differences, and that may never change. And I think that's something, going back to the original question of what love is, I think a lot of love stories that we have depicted is that love changes people. And may it change people? Yes. Is that the definition of love? I don't think so. I think that's a definition we have from society of like, my love is so powerful that you will forego yourself and choose us always. And that's not necessarily what I would want for me. So I'm going to be asking and challenging my couple, like, what is your idea of love? Where is this idea that love is going to change someone's religious understanding? And that's important in all fill in the blank identity. I think the last, I'm trying to think of, I did want to kind of, there was one question about KINK and BIPOC. And I don't know that I would have time to like go into this, but I think the same as what we're talking about, and Melissa, please, you guys can jump into of like, I think it's about just being open to have the conversation, and your discomfort and comfort matters. So just becoming a little bit more maybe versed, maybe looking into what areas you don't know. And then also, you don't have to be an expert. You can just ask the couple, what is this for you, right? How important is this? Why is this important? And helping them understand where their differences is. Because what I would say with sexuality in general, with sexual expression, oftentimes dialogue is missing. So for a couple, especially for a BIPOC couple that may have some other oppression or other identities that are kind of oppressing their identities, I would want to say like, hey, how are these in conflict at times? You know, maybe you have an interracial couple, one couple that hasn't experienced as much oppression and they feel very like KINK positive. And then you have another person that has experienced a lot of maybe genderism or some ageism or some racism. And they have some other things that make them harder to get to this place where they feel like I can access whatever sexual expression I want. And that may be where the disconnect is. It's not so much on the KINK, but it's more on the conversation as to why one person may be different than another person, and having the opportunity to discuss that and really exploring like, are you uncomfortable, or are these the messages that you receive that make you uncomfortable? And having the space that is not shameful to be able to unpack like, oh, actually, now that I think about it, that messaging comes from da 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 da. Or when I think about it, I don't actually have an issue, a moral issue with this, or like a value issue. It's more like a message I heard that this is maybe, you know, some messages of like, oh, well, that makes you this kind of person, or that changes your value as a person if you're accessing these kind of sexual experiences and preferences. So again, I think it's important about facilitation, less about expertise on the knowledge or even thinking that you are going to become an expert, because everyone is very specific.
Yes. It makes me think about humility as a whole. Like as counselors, we don't have to know everything. It's okay to not know every single thing that comes into the room. And having that humility is incredibly important. And even in thinking about KINK, I always think about like, what are ways in which I'm hoping to connect with my partner as well. And so like trying to remember, okay, don't let that fear as a counselor or your own discomfort, like you said, get on the way of like what the underlying message is here as well.
I love that. I'm trying to connect with my partner. And that is the kind of going back to RCT is like, that's the point. And if we can get kind of clouded with like, oh, well, they're making them do something they don't want to, or I feel uncomfortable with what they're saying that they are wanting to experience. And it's like, wait, let me take a step back. Let's facilitate the conversation of like, how are you connecting through this? How is this giving you more energy and giving you more experiences that you want? And how do you negotiate that when they're different? And that, again, you can drop in any content, and that's the same framework of ultimately humans are wired for connection. How am I as a counselor facilitating their connection to themselves, to each other, to the world around them? And that is, in a nutshell, what RCT offers, I think, couples work. One, there were 3 more questions that we had, and it was, how do you address fatphobia in one partner? And I think the same thing. RCT would be unpacking, what are the messages? What told that partner that a certain body is attractive, and helping them unpack that. That may be something that you have to refer out or have individual sessions because you want to catch those bullets. You don't want to like let the exposed partner just sit there and listen to every idea that the person has about like that's just not necessarily what I would want to do. But I would equate it also to like, what are some messages you've heard? Let's say this was a heterosexual couple, and it was often I've seen this more where the male partner has like some ideas of what the woman partner has their body should look like. So then I would be asking some ideas of what are some messages of men. So like a man that loses their hair is seen in society as maybe less attractive, right? So something you have maybe no control over. Why should you feel less than a person because of something in your body? And that would be like where I would try to bring that empathy, that mutual empathy, versus trying to necessarily debunk the different ideas this person has. It's more about the connection, going back to the connection, like what is this connecting them? And then ultimately, if you love this person and they're telling you that this is affecting their spirit, their soul, their healing, their sexuality, then that is motivation enough to at the very least address it differently, or not have this conversation in a space that creates a disconnection within the couple. So a lot of great questions. The only other questions we didn't get to was like how to remain grounded and how not to have triangulation. And I think we'll just kind of close with the beginning part of our conversation is doing your work, right? Like couples work is hard, but it's honestly really fun when you kind of take away the mystery and realize these are 2 humans doing the impossible, which I think couples work is very, like, I described it to one couple. I was like, it's a miracle. And you want to look at a miracle. This is a miracle. 2 people born in different circumstances with different language. And I don't mean language as in language. I mean, every wording has a different encoding to the individual based on the time and space they existed. And that means that it's a miracle when 2 people can align enough to love unconditionally and to love each other. And therefore, when you're in that presence, you're really looking at this from this wonder perspective of like, how wonderful that you guys have come together. How can we take away the things that are getting into the connection and really just foster more connection? But part of that, in my opinion, and in my lived experiences, comes from you doing your work. Connection starts here, then you can foster it here, and then you can foster it between.
Wow. Thank you so much, Angie. I really appreciate your time. Like, I have many, many more questions, but that'll be for another time. I really, really appreciate you sharing your passion and your insight with us. Any like leaving kind of thoughts, like if there's one thing that you would want whoever's watching this or listening to this, like what's one thing that you would want to make sure they take away with them? I heard a little bit of that towards the end already, but
I think the biggest thing I would say is addressing the fear, your attachment fear. And the biggest fear that I find people experience as a couple counselor or therapist is like, what if I can't? What if I can't support them? And it's like, but what if you can create the safest place that they have the best opportunity to discovering connection? Doesn't mean that every couple takes it. It doesn't mean that everyone will get there. But if you can see the power of holding that space, then you don't have to worry so much about, did I get the 8 steps in EFT? Did I get, the family system correct? Did I use the right language at the right time? Did I broach this? But it's like, stay present. And the presence that you bring will allow you to be able to say, like, let's stop this. This is not pretty, and I'm not doing the perfect counseling skill, but I'm going to stop you before you hurt your partner. And I'm going to help you direct what I need you to see. And that, again, it gives me kind of chills, because when it happens, you see the shift, you see the energy shift, you see the love shift, because everyone wants to love and be loved. And that is something that we're all capable of facilitating, especially going through this amazing program. And all of you that are watching, I know that you're capable. It's just mostly our own fears of, is this too big for me? Am I going to be able to enter the room and stay grounded? And I do think it takes work, but when you get there, it is a very beautiful thing to witness, to be part of, and to be able to have worked enough on your stuff to know, like, oh, I can actually be present. And that's pretty cool too. Like, you're like, wow, I've healed enough in my journey to be able to support other people in their healing journey.
Thank you so much, Angie.
Thank you for having me. Thank you for the conversation, and thank you for everyone watching. And I would love, if there are any other questions or any other curiosities, of course, let's keep the questions, like the communication. I think the biggest thing that I just want to just give kudos is, this is an amazing idea, an amazing kind of experience, and kudos to both of you in your initiative. And I don't know where the idea originated.
That's all Melissa. Let's give her kudos.
Let's just give a lot of kudos here. This is really cool, really neat. And I think that just speaks to that intentionality of wherever you go, transforming the spaces that you're in. And this is a great evidence of that.
If people want to get in touch with you or learn more about the work that you're doing right now, how can they find you?
I think we share a practice that we're working at. I'm currently housed and homed in Three Birds Counseling. You can find me. My email is Angiemil, ANGIEMIL, at threebirdscounseling.com. Is that correct? Right? I was like, oh, I always get that. So you can email me. I love conversations to a fault, and I love connection. Maybe it gets in the way of productivity sometimes, but I value it to a very high degree. So I welcome any conversations. And I know that if you're sitting at this kind of place of wanting to do this work, it's because you care. And I think that's important to foster and to nurture so that you don't feel overwhelmed.
Thank you so much. And I finally remembered what were the other 2 announcements I was going to make really quick. For whatever reason, I couldn't find it earlier. And just to remind CEB students that we still have the community clothing exchange going on. So like anytime you're by the Vacc, feel free to hop on and see what we have, or if you have anything that you would like to drop off to just kind of give others, do that as well. And then there's food at the refueling station. Thank you so much to everybody that keeps dropping off stuff. Like if you need a snack, if you didn't bring something to eat, like feel free to pass by and let us know if you need anything. So I think that with that, we end here. I hope everybody has a great day. And I'll talk to you two later. Bye.
Be well.